Okay, I hope you're as excited to learn about Kabbalah as I am. This is like the highlight of the Jewish history curriculum. This is where we learn how to do magic with Kabbalah. Okay, so the term Kabbalah, which a lot of times is really referred to when we're talking about Jewish mysticism. What Jewish mysticism means is basically the best way to describe it is as opposed to rationalism. So it's when we're talking about ideas that are not purely logical or based on only reason or the things that you can see, but mysticism refers to things that are not seen. It refers to the hidden. Sometimes Kabbalah is called Torat HaNistar. Nistar meaning what is not seen or what is hidden. The actual word Kabbalah comes from to receive, lekabel, to receive, and it refers to this tradition, this Jewish mystical tradition that was received, passed down from generation to generation orally, meaning it wasn't written down. And the reason it wasn't written down is because it was meant to be kept kind of secret and only to be known by a certain small group of people. The reason why we're learning about Kabbalah now is because at this point in Jewish history, and we're talking about the early 16th century, there's a big explosion of Kabbalah learning. Some of the most important authors of Kabbalistic texts were written at this time, and some of the most important texts were written at this time. Some of the most important authors and thinkers within Kabbalah lived at this time, especially in Tzfat, in the north of Eretz Yisrael, as we learned about a little bit earlier this week, and we're going to talk about more now. And we'll get into later why is it that if Kabbalah was a secret oral tradition, why did it become something that had a lot of things were written about it at this point in time? We'll get to all of that very soon. So the Kabbalah is huge. There's a huge amount of text and a huge amount of thought, lots and lots of books written about Kabbalah. And I am certainly not going to claim to be an expert. And even if I were an expert, I would not be able to teach you anywhere near, what Kabbalah, what Kabbalah is really about, and the depth of Kabbalah in just the small amount of time that we have. So we're going to just talk about some headlines, some highlights, and just some basic ideas when it comes to Kabbalah. And so what we're going to be learning about here is we're going to be learning about two different types of Kabbalah. It's helpful to break it down in this way. There's something called theoretical Kabbalah and practical Kabbalah. So when we talk about theoretical Kabbalah, we're not talking about the kind of Kabbalah that you might hear of sometimes, and you hear about a Mekubal or a Mekubal who reads people's minds or tells people what's going to happen in their future based on their Kabbalah powers. That's the practical Kabbalah. The theoretical Kabbalah is just attempts to understand the complexities and the deep hidden meanings of the world and of the Torah and of Judaism based on this mystical understanding. And meaning, like we said before, it's not necessarily a reason-based idea. It is more of a kind of a mystical, a hidden, a supernatural understanding of how the world works. Practical Kabbalah, like I said before, that's when you get into the ideas of the strings that people might wear, or the brachot that maybe a Mekubal will give out, and people will say, there are stories of people who go to, they're not couples who are not able to have children, and they go to a Mekubal to get a bracha that they should have children, that that they somehow harness the power of Kabbalah in order to do that. Or to get healed if they're sick, whatever it may be, whether that actually works or not is not what I'm going to discuss now, or whether I believe it or not. But the point is that is what practical Kabbalah is. Practical Kabbalah is harnessing these ideas to use for an actual outcome, whereas theoretical Kabbalah is just simply to use the ideas of Kabbalah in order to understand the world and Torah and Judaism better. So the Tzfat, in that city in the north of Israel, that many of you may have been to, or at least have heard about, is kind of the Kabbalah capital of the world. And it was there in the early 1600s or throughout the 15th century and beyond, where what was known as the Golden Age of Kabbalah. And that's where people like the Arizal or the Ari HaKadosh that you may have heard of lived. That's also where the Shulchan Aruch, Rav Yosef Karo, who is also a Kabbalist, while on the one hand he wrote the Shulchan Aruch, which is a halachic work. He also was a Kabbalist. Rav Shlomo Alkabetz, the author of Lecha Dodi, and lived in Tzfat at this time, and he was also a Mekubal. Even the whole minhag of going out and saying Lechad and saying Kabbalat Shabbat, that a lot of that was developed actually in Tzfat, where people would walk out into, look out into the mountains on Erev Shabbat and greet the Shabbat from coming. It was a very spiritual place. If you look out, like here, this picture here, you look out into the landscape, and it's beautiful. There are trees, and it's blue sky, as almost always is there in the north of Eretz Yisrael. These rolling hills. Very spiritual place, and that was maybe that landscape inspired a lot of these Kabbalists to write and to think the way that they did. So we're going to talk about the Zohar for a moment, and the Zohar you may have heard of. The Zohar is considered to be like the most important book written on Kabbalah. Depending on when you believe it was written, also has an impact on exactly what where it stands in terms of like works of Kabbalah. So the Zohar claims to have been written by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the Tana from the times of the Mishnah, who lived in a cave for like 40 years with his son. Right, that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, you may have heard of him. His yortzeit is on Lag BaOmer. It's considered to be, for Kabbalists, like a very big deal. That's where like the bonfires come in. So the Zohar, again, like I said, claims to be written by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. What happens, and this is not the only book that's like this, there are a lot of books that say that they're written by a certain individual, when the reality is that they may not have actually been written by that person, but really much later, and the person who actually wrote it goes and says, oh, well, this was written by, someone who lived like 1,000 years ago. It was probably written by a rabbi in Spain in the 1200s, a 13th century rabbi, and there is a number of pieces of evidence that indicate that. First of all, if this really, really important book were actually written by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai in the 2nd century CE, why did it never get quoted or heard of before the 13th century? So that's kind of a giveaway that it probably wasn't around before that. Also, some of the language in it indicates that it's not, the use of language indicates that it's not really from the time of the Mishnah. But in any event, the Zohar is an extremely important book, and it details some of the basic Kabbalistic beliefs of the way that Judaism works, and it builds on psukim and on midrashim, and it teaches Torah in a mystical, in a Kabbalistic sense, and it really lays out some of the most basic beliefs of Kabbalah. Jumping ahead a little bit, or a lot, depending on when, again, you believe that the Zohar was written, was a very important individual named Rav Moshe Cordovero. As his name indicates, he was probably born, or at least his parents were born in or from Cordova, Spain. And he, if you can see where he lived, when he lived, so right after, a little bit after the expulsion from Spain, and he was an extremely important Kabbalistic thinker and writer. So what he did, what was most significant thing that he did, was he took the teachings of the Kabbalah that were taught before his life, and he kind of organized them into a very clear, concise, or not necessarily so concise, but into a clear, organized system of thought. So you had an idea from here, and this Kabbalistic idea, and you had the Zohar, and you had this text and that text, and the Ramak, Rav Moshe Cordovero, put all these ideas together and explained them in a very clear way and systemized, organized way. He described the concept, which is very, very big in Kabbalah, called the concept of the 10 Sfirot. And if you see this picture here, which you may have seen before, this is a picture of the 10 Sfirot. The idea of the 10 Sfirot is that God created the world, and he created human beings, and human beings are very limited, obviously, and God is unlimited. So there's a difficult question that philosophers, or religious philosophers, had been dealing with for a long time, and that is, how could something like human beings, something that's so imperfect and so finite, relate to God, who is perfect, who is infinite, right? How could that even be? How could people do that? So the 10 Sfirot is a way of explaining that, where God emanates into the world. He doesn't. He's able to connect with people through individual attributes. And the higher up a person is, then the more connected to God that they can be. So if you look here, the 10th Sphira is the Sphira of Malchut, the kingship. So that's like the closest attribute that a person can get to. And if a person is holier and a person studies more Kabbalah, they can get a little bit higher to the attribute of Yesod. And then there are different Sfirot. There's Chesed and there's Gevurah. And ultimately there's Keter, which is all the way on top, which is like the most connected to the essence of God. Essentially, the idea is that we can't know the essence of God because we're human beings, but we can know his attributes. We can't really understand and connect to God, who God really is, but we can connect to the attributes of God. If that's complicated to understand, then good, because it's supposed to be complicated, right? Kabbalah is kind of complicated, and that's kind of the idea here, is that it was a way of trying to make something that was like, impossible to understand, how human beings can connect to God, and it's trying to make that, believable, not believable, but, understandable, at least in some way, to human beings. So, right, essentially that's what we said before. The lower the sphira, then the more attainable it is for human beings, and the less concentrated it is to God itself. So if you think about like the sphirot are all like emanations of light, the source being like all the way on top, like as if it's like the sun. So like a person can't touch the sun, it's too hot, it's too intense, but like you can look at something that the light of the sun bounces off of, and that's kind of like the way the sphirot work. Another really, really important person in the history of Kabbalah is someone named the Arizal, who I mentioned before. The Arizal was Rav Yitzchak Luria, Zal comes from Zichrono Levracha. So the Ari Zichrono Levracha, Adonenu Rav Yitzchak Zichrono Levracha. So that's the Arizal. So he was an interesting person. He was very charismatic. He was known by people to be, he was a great teacher of Kabbalah. He studied Halacha and Kabbalah in Jerusalem. He was born in Germany, so he was an Ashkenazi man, but he davened Nusach Sarad, and then he ultimately kind of created his own Nusach, his own different text of davening, which a lot of people use today, Nusach Ari, which is a little bit different than the Nusach of the Sfardim, but it's mostly similar to that. If you see like inside the Sidurim, like the menorahs that have like Hashem's name, those are like from the Ari Siddurs. So the Ari believed certain very interesting things. The Ari believed that he had a certain level of prophecy. He said about the Ramak, about Rav Moshe Cordovero, that at his funeral, at the Ramak's funeral, he studied Kabbalah from the Ramak, from Rav Moshe Cordovero. And the Arizal said that at the Ramak's funeral, he saw a pillar of fire, a heavenly pillar of fire, leading the casket when they were going to bury him. He believed that he could speak to great teachers of the past. He only wore white on Shabbat, which was like, again, a way of kind of like being like a malach, like he was above. He was above the physical. He wasn't like a regular human being, especially on Shabbat. Shabbat was like this special spiritual day, and he was, like kind of like an angel, and that's why he wore all white. So like I said, he believed that that great teachers of the past would come and speak to him from the afterlife. When he moved to Tzfat in 1569, he did so because Eliyahu Hanavi, he understood, or he believed, or he claimed Eliyahu Hanavi came and spoke to him and told him to do so. He also believed that he could see people's sins, or know people's sins, by looking at their forehead. So he was a very interesting person, and this is kind of like, I don't want to say stereotype, but it's kind of like this, when we think about Kabbalists, we're not, again, it's not like the Rambam, who's like pure, rational, logical. Some of these things like are hard for you to understand, hard for me to understand, hard for anyone to understand, because it's hard to explain the reasoning behind them, and especially if you don't really understand a lot of the the basics in Kabbalah. But part of the idea that some of these things don't make sense is because Kabbalah is not rational. It's spiritual. It's meta. It's meta rational. It's above rationality. It's above reason. It's a totally kind of different set of logic in its own right. So we'll stop here for now, and that's some of the, again, just to recap some of the basics in terms of the Zohar and Tzvat and the Ramak and the Arizal.